So Jeremiah 16. We saw last week that the events of World War I were working together to bring about the reality of the Balfour Declaration. By the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire, which had resisted a Zionist state and persecuted the Jewish people, was in decline and about to collapse. At the same time, the Empire of Great Britain was raised to unparalleled heights because of the government of Great Britain's kindness to the Jewish people and its support of a Jewish state in the Holy Land. This is nothing new. God has done this in the past. He raised up King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon to chastise his people and to remove them from the land in judgment of his people. But then God raised up Persia to judge Babylon. And it was the Persian king Cyrus who supported the Jewish people's return to the land at the end of that 70 years of exile. The Lord raised up the British Empire to accomplish his purpose of bringing the Jewish people back to their ancestral land in these last days. But unfortunately, the support of the British government would wane, and it did. In between the two wars, and then during World War II, the British government severely restricted the number of Jewish people immigrating to the Holy Land because there was fear of Arab uprisings. And there actually were some Arab uprisings in 1936 and 1937. And there were other restrictions the British imposed upon the Jewish people in order to maintain, if they could, the peace with the Arabs who were already living in the land. For instance, in 1930, the government of Britain forbid the blowing of the shofar at the Western Wall there in Jerusalem by Jews. It wasn't allowed to be blown from 1930 on until 1948. On July 18th, 1947, the Royal Navy intercepted a ship, the Exodus 1947, a ship laden with 4,515 refugees from the Holocaust. The passengers resisted violently when the British Royal Navy boarded the ship there in the Mediterranean off the coast of Israel. 2 of the passengers died as a result, and one of the crewmen in this fight. And the Royal Navy sent the ship back to France from where it came. When they got back to France, the French government said, only the people who want to leave the ship may leave the ship. If you want to stay, stay. And so they stayed, all of them, all those refugees stayed. They refused to leave the ship, and they stayed there for weeks. And then finally, the ship left and went to Hamburg, Germany, where they were forcibly removed from the ship and put into displaced persons camps in Germany. The British government did that. Well, in response to increasing British restrictions, Jewish militia raised up like the Irgun and the Lehi, and they staged armed insurrections against the British. By the end of World War II, the British Empire was breaking up and it was in decline. It was nothing of what it used to be. It was a shell of its former glory. Now, the Lord now began to ready another nation for his purposes, the United States of America. But that's for later. For this morning, I want to share with you some other events that were taking place and working together to bring about the establishment of the nation of Israel. These events were also part of the Jubilee cycle, but of a different nature and of a different timetable. But before we get there, I want to show you these verses from Jeremiah 16, a prophecy that Jeremiah was given to Jeremiah. And so beginning in verse 9, we can see how all these things are going to work out. Look at verse 9. For this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Before your eyes and in your days, I will bring an end to the sounds of joy and gladness and to the voices of bride and bridegroom in this place. When you tell these people all this and they ask you, why has the Lord decreed such a great disaster against us? What wrong have we done? What sin have we committed against the Lord our God? Then say to them, it is because your fathers forsook me, declares the Lord, and followed other gods and served and worshiped them. They forsook me and did not keep my law. But you have behaved more wickedly than your fathers. See how each of you is following the stubbornness of his evil heart instead of obeying me. So here's God's problem. He's got this problem with his people. All the way back in Jeremiah's time, they have forsaken him. They have forsaken his law. And so now Jeremiah announces God's judgment. So he says in verse 13, so I will throw you out of this land into a land neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you will serve other gods day and night, for I will show you no favor. However, this is one of God's big buts, one of his howevers. However, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when men will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt. But they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north, and out of all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to the land I gave their forefathers. But now I will send for many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will catch them. After that I will send for many hunters, and they will hunt them down on every mountain and hill and from the crevices of the rock. There was a boy who had a dream when he was 12 years old. He kind of kept the dream secret so people wouldn't laugh at him. But in his dream, he dreamt that the Messiah, he was a Jewish boy, he dreamt that the Messiah lifted him into the clouds where he encountered Moses. The Messiah said to Moses, it is for this child that I have prayed. Then he turned to the boy and said, go and declare to the Jews that I shall come soon and perform great wonders and great deeds for my people and for the whole world. That boy that had that dream, his name was Theodore Herzl. As a 12-year-old, he pondered the meaning of the dream, and like I said, kept it to himself for fear of ridicule. But he never forgot it. It was always there, and he talked about it later on in his life. You might remember that Herzl, I mentioned him before, he was the founder of the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. The Zionist Congress was a political movement founded by Herzl based on his belief that the Jewish people could never live in peace in any foreign land and so needed a state of their own. He wrote, the Jewish question persists wherever Jews live in appreciable numbers. Wherever it does not exist, it is brought in together with Jewish immigrants. We are naturally drawn into those places where we are not persecuted, and our appearance there gives rise to persecution. This is the case and will inevitably be so everywhere, even in highly civilized countries, see, for instance, France, so long as the Jewish question is not solved on the political level. Therefore, I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We will live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. And whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare, we will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. That's what he believed, and that was the mission of his life. And so Herzl worked tirelessly to those ends. And like I said, he started that first Zionist Congress, which goes on even today. Now they meet in Jerusalem. Then for many years, they met in Basel, Switzerland. Herzl died at the age of 44 in 1904. He never ever saw the dream of a Jewish state realized, but he worked for it. Go back to Jeremiah again, verse 14. However, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when men will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt. Verse 15, but they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north, and out of all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to the land I gave their forefathers. But now I will send for many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will catch them. Herzl was a fisherman. He was fishing for Jewish people dispersed throughout the world to bring them back to the promised land and restore them. After the first Zionist Congress in Basel, which today is known as the World Zionist Organization, it ended in August 1897. Herzl wrote in his diary, he wrote this in his diary, "Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly," this was in his diary, "it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state." Herzl and men like him were fishermen, but there was more to Jeremiah's prophecy. Verse 16 goes on to say, "After that, I will send for my hunters, and they will hunt them down on every mountain and hill and from crevices on the rocks." The hunters would come in the form of the Nazis with a general boycott of German Jews, Kristallnacht, the Dachau concentration camp, the Nuremberg laws, the final solution, and the Holocaust. The hunters would drive the Jewish people out of Europe and into the Holy Land, those who survived being hunted. Herzl's dream of a Jewish state was coalescing into a reality, helped in no small part by the political movement that he founded. And it would come by his work and as a result of a staggering, horrific persecution of the Jewish people. A few days after that first Zionist Congress, he wrote again in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it." Certainly in 50 years, he wrote, everyone will know about the founding of the Jewish state. Herzl wrote in his diary a prophetic word in line with the Jubilean mystery. Remember the Jubilean mystery, Leviticus 25:13? "In the year of Jubilee, each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors." In the years following World War II, the British government turned the issue of Palestine over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN set up a committee to address the matter, the UN Special Committee on Palestine. The committee worked on the problem for several months and finally came up with a solution that came to be known as the Partition Plan. According to the plan, British occupation would come to an end on a certain day, and the land would be divided in two, a Jewish state and an Arab state. If the plan were approved, it would mean a Jewish nation would exist in the Promised Land for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. It would mean that a nation that had been totally annihilated and carried off, its capital destroyed, its people scattered upon the earth, that kind of a nation would come into being again. That had never happened in history again. It's never happened since. Well, the plan took the form of a resolution to be put to a vote before the United Nations General Assembly. It required that those occupying the land, the British, relinquish it, and to those whom the land belonged, return to it. Well, as the committee is working on the plan, the 50th Jubilean World Zionist Congress is taking place in Basel, Switzerland at that same time, celebrating the Jubilee, as I said, of the Zionist Congress. The partition plan was finished on August 31st, 1947, 50 years to the day of the conclusion of Theodor Herzl's first Zionist Congress in Basel. One of the leaders of the 1947 Jubilee World Zionist Congress is Chaim Weizmann. I mentioned him before too. He would become the first president of the new nation of Israel. He addressed the attendees and he said about the partition plan, which he knew was being talked about at the UN at that time. He said, "I believe on this very day, symbolically, a document will be signed which, with God's help, may become the beginning of redemption." On the same day The Jubilee was being celebrated in the place where Zionism began, the plan that would fulfill the ancient prophecies of redemption, and the dream of a Jewish nation birthed 50 years earlier was completed. 50 years to the exact date. After the completion, the partition plan was officially received and recorded in the United Nations General Assembly. That took place on September 3rd, 1947. Now, this is interesting because on September 3rd, 1897, Herzl wrote in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it." He wrote that September 3rd, 1897. And on September 3rd, 1947, the UN General Assembly received UN Resolution 181, the partition plan of Palestine, to vote upon. The partition plan would go into effect if the UN General Assembly approved it by a 2/3 majority. This was going to be a tough vote. The outcome was in doubt right up to the last days before the vote of November 29th, 1947. But you know what? God is sovereign. And God directs the heart of the king, or the hearts of the kings, wherever he wills. And he brought together an unlikely set of factors. The Soviet Union was part of the UN. The Soviet Union, the world's chief atheistic power, was certainly not in favor of fulfilling biblical prophecy and would become eventually Israel's arch enemy. But Joseph Stalin saw an opportunity in the birth of a Jewish state as a way to weaken and roll back the British Empire in the Middle East, and at the same time increase Soviet influence in the Middle East. So the Soviet Union, with the Eastern European satellite nations of the USSR, which were now part of the UN too, all voted together as a bloc in favor of the partition plan. Now, the American State Department was against the partition plan, but God had raised up an American president who was in favor of it. Franklin Roosevelt, in his fourth and last campaign for president, had chosen for his running mate an unlikely guy named Harry S. Truman. So on January 20th, 1945, Harry Truman became vice president of the United States. Now, here's something interesting. By February 1945, it was clear that Germany was nearly defeated. So Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta to make plans for a post-war Germany and Europe. On the way back from the conference, Roosevelt stopped in Saudi Arabia, and he met with King Ibn Saud. The meeting was to forge an agreement that would give the U.S. favored oil rights in exchange for American protection of Saudi Arabia. Well, there was mounting support within the U.S. and throughout the world for the Jewish people to have their own state, but King Saud and the Arabs were against it. And so he pressured Roosevelt not to support such an arrangement. And Roosevelt, at that meeting, promised the king that he would not support a Jewish state in the Holy Land. In a letter dated March 10th, that meeting happened February 14th. So in a letter dated March 10th, after Roosevelt was already back in Washington, King Saud sent him a letter. And again, he asked Roosevelt to keep his word relative to the Jewish state. He wrote, "We state frankly and plainly that to help Zionism in Palestine not only means to endanger Palestine, but all neighboring countries." Well, Roosevelt responded to his letter in a letter dated April 5th, 1945. He said, "Your Majesty will also doubtless recall that during our recent conversation, I assured you that I would take no action in my capacity as chief of the executive branch of this government, which might prove hostile to the Arab people. With regard to the question of Palestine, the policy of this government in this respect is unchanged." Roosevelt was against a Jewish state, and he would make sure that his government was against a Jewish state. And so he put people in his State Department that were against a Jewish state. In his response, Roosevelt allowed, you can read these letters online, King Saud made all kinds of vicious attacks and lies against the Jews, and Roosevelt let those all go unchallenged. He even seemed to be in agreement with them. A week later, on April 12th, 1945, which is about the same day that most people think King Saud received his letter, Roosevelt died. Harry S. Truman, who had deep sympathies for the suffering of the Jewish people, was now catapulted to the most powerful position in the new most powerful nation on the face of the earth. And he had to work against the State Department filled with these Roosevelt cronies that had been established for years. These are bureaucrats that are hard to get rid of. But they were there, and he worked against them. And so he forged the passage of the UN Resolution 181, which would bring about the resurrection of the nation of Israel nearly 2,000 years after its demise. So on November 29th, 1947, the United Nations met at Lake Success, New York, and there took up UN Resolution 181. The final count was 33 votes in favor, 13 votes against, and 10 abstentions. The resolution passed, and Israel would again become a nation. Now, November 29th, 1947 was a Saturday. It was the Shabbat. Remember I said that every Shabbat has a parsha, a portion of the Torah that is read? The parsha for that Saturday, November 29th, 1947, is Genesis 32, verse 4, through Genesis 36, verse 43. It tells the story of Jacob's return to the Holy Land after working for his uncle Laban for at least 20 years in Padan Aram. In verse 32:9, Jacob is praying. He acknowledges the Lord had said to him, return to your country, return to your family. It's the story of Jacob reuniting with his brother Esau, who years earlier had sworn to kill Jacob. Esau's descendants are the people of Jordan and Arabia. The return of Jacob, the return of Israel, reignites the old fears and fights just as it did in Genesis. Jacob and Esau fortunately reconciled for a bit, but Esau's descendants became enemies of the Jewish people. When the Jewish state was announced, Arabs began to arm themselves for battle against the Jews. It's also those passages, the reconfirming of the covenant that God made with Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, and his father, Isaac. In chapter 35, verse 12, he says, the land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. No qualifications. I will give this land to your descendants after. Now, the partition plan, UN Resolution 181, gave no name for the new Jewish state. Several names were proposed, Zion and Judah, but it was another name that would be chosen. The name chosen was also from the Parsha. David read it for us this morning. In Genesis 32, we read about Jacob wrestling with an angel of the Lord. We learn from Hosea that angel of the Lord was none other than God himself and the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, and that's a whole nother sermon. But Jacob wouldn't let him go until he received a blessing. And so the angel changed his name from Jacob to Israel. It's the first time Israel appears in the Word of God. On May 14th, 1948, about 6 months after the events of November 1947, a new nation would appear on the earth. Israel, which means he struggles with God, would be the name of that new nation. When we get together next time, we'll talk about the birth of Israel in 1948 and then some of the wars that Israel had to struggle with. It's an absolute miracle that that nation survived because it shouldn't have. It doesn't make any sense from a human physical point. But when you know God is the one who's fighting for you, why, it makes perfect sense.